Today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 13th of August of 2026. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, let's talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very important updates, but probably the most important one we received right before we started making the video. According to information we have, Ukraine has proposed to Russia a mutual halt to strikes on civilian targets in the Black Sea. That was stated by Reuters. The proposal was conveyed to Moscow through a third party, but Kiev has not yet received a response. So, summarizing everything, we can say that Ukrainians asked Russians to stop attacking vessels through the Black Sea, commercial vessels first of all, and Ukrainians asked the Russians to stop attacking the Odessa port infrastructure. I would like to remind you that this war, this logistic war, or the Black Sea war was started from the Ukrainian side. So they started attacking vessels and the ships of Russians through the Sea of Azov. Later they shift their focus to the Black Sea, and the attacks that we have seen since the beginning of July of 2026 were something like retaliation from the Russian side. And now we see that the Ukrainians are asking to stop this. They started, but they understand that they can't stop this by themselves. The question is whether the Russians are going to accept this. I'm not sure, but at least the Russians may accept this proposal or this deal, but not today. Not today, not tomorrow, but right after the export period of time ends. Ukrainian grain exports plummeted amid Russian military strikes on port infrastructure. In the first 12 days of August, Ukraine significantly reduced export volumes of key grain crops amid attacks on port infrastructure and disruption to sea roads. Wheat 175,000 tons compared to 759 tons a year earlier, a 4.3-fold decrease. Barley 37,000 tons, a 5.6-fold decrease compared to the same period of time last year. Corn 68,000 tons, a 2.7-fold decrease. And obviously this is just the beginning. If the Russians continue attacking the infrastructure, obviously this is just the beginning. Up to 90% of Ukrainian exports were previously shipped by sea. Decreased navigation safety and damage to port infrastructure have significantly reduced Ukraine's capacity to export agricultural products. So this is first of all the export problems the Ukrainians began suffering, and the next important thing is the deal, the military deal between the United States of America, Turkey and Ukraine. And according to this deal, if you remember, the Ukrainians wants to receive cluster munition attack-on missiles from the territory of Turkey, and probably the only possible way how to do this is using the Black Sea, or maybe this is the position of Turkey. So this is another reason why the Russians most likely will not accept this deal right now, today, before the beginning of the Russian major offensive operation, right before the beginning of the parliament elections. Maybe right after the Russians will accept the deal during the winter period of time and so on. But when talking about the winter period of time, this is the moment when most likely the Ukrainians will not need this deal. As for the previous 24 hours, the Russians continued attacking the territory of the Odessa region. The sources reported, and more precisely the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported, that the Russians attacked the port of Chernomorsk, fuel storage tanks and port infrastructure facilities used for unloading and sorting military cargo was damaged. At the port of the city of Odessa, bulk carrier carrying military equipment equipped with electronic warfare systems and a tanker carrying fuel for the Ukraine armed forces was damaged, and so on. Furthermore, during the day, we received lots of updates that when talking about the Odessa region, lots of locomotives were damaged and destroyed. So, for example, this is the photo of the damaged locomotive in the Odessa region. So, as you can see in these pictures, the locomotive was badly damaged, probably destroyed. Furthermore, the Russians published a video where we can see how exactly the Russians were attacking trains and the locomotives through the territory of the Odessa region. And just through this video, we can see at least 2 episodes how the Russians were destroying the Ukraine's logistics. So as you can see, the Russians are focused on this region, trying to cut the Odessa region from the mainland and to hold attacks, mutual attacks in the area of the Black Sea probably is not something that the Russians are interested. Maybe the Russians will accept the deal, but this must be a wider deal. Not just a deal not to attack the territory of Odessa, but a deal where the Ukrainians will promise that they will not attack the territory of Crimea and the Crimean infrastructure, and maybe then the Russians will accept this deal. Once again, as for the previous 24 hours, the Russians were attacking logistics, vessels, infrastructure. The Russians were attacking gas stations, and the Russians were attacking port infrastructure also along the river of Danube. So this is the situation in this area. Let's wait and see what is the Russian response will be. But something tells me that the Ukrainians, the Russians will probably deny or reject this proposal, or they will accept this proposal, but much after, much later. Now let's move further and let's discuss more statements made by the President of Ukraine, Zelensky. Zelensky stated that Ukraine needs 5% of its Patriot missile stockpile to survive the winter, and 10% to fully defend itself against ballistic missiles. In an interview with CNN, Zelensky stated that Ukraine needs significantly more Patriot interceptor missiles to protect its airspace during the upcoming winter. According to Kyiv needs about 5% of the US Patriot missile stockpile to simply survive the winter. To fully close Ukrainian airspace to Russian ballistic missiles, Zelensky said about 10% of the US stockpile would be required. So every time when Zelensky start talking about missiles, about Patriot systems, this means that the Russians most likely finished preparation before the next massive attack. So we believe that in coming 42 or 72 hours, the Russians will attack the territory of Ukraine, and most likely using once again dozens of missiles. Another important article: recently Ukraine submitted new proposal to the United States regarding the peace process, according to Zelensky. But this article, by the way, was published this morning, and this evening we received another article about about strikes in the Black Sea in the area of Odessa. So probably these two articles are about the same thing. He said that as for this proposal, the United States rejected this idea, concerning this idea probably without any chances to be accepted by both the Russians and the Ukrainians. Another important thing is that a crisis is brewing on the territory of Ukraine, and we are talking about business. We're not talking about military, we're not talking about a political crisis, we're talking about business crisis. Russia is disrupting the logistics of Ukrainian business. Dairy products, meat and cigarettes are disappearing from shelves. Strikes on Ukrainian warehouse infrastructure are seriously disrupting the supply of goods, report RBK Ukraine. Since the beginning of the special military operation, approximately 1 million square meters of warehouse space has been damaged, of which approximately 750,000 square meters are in the Kiev region. And for example, this video was published today from Kiev, and as you can see, this is a mall. This is probably big mall with empty shelves. So this is the situation in Ukraine, and probably this is another reason why Zelensky asked Russia to hold strikes, because lots of products, lots of different products for people Ukraine was receiving also through the area of Odessa port infrastructure. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the ground. During the previous 24 hours, lots of very interesting changes were recorded. And first, let's talk about the Sumy direction. Since the beginning of the Sumy offensive operation, the Russians were mainly attacking from three directions. The Russians were attacking the city of Kyiv from the north, and since the beginning of the Sumy battle, the Russians have improved their position significantly. Basically, the Russians answered the second defense layer of the city of Sumy, and the Russians continue developing their position there. The Russians answered the Sumy big forest, and this is a very important situation because the Russians right now are well protected against Ukrainian drones. The second offensive operation is taking place to the east of the city of Sumy, and since the beginning of this offensive operation, the Russians managed to take under complete control at least three big towns in this area: the town of Magritsa, the town of Zapsili, and the town of Miropolye. When summarize these three towns, we can say that the Russians are able to concentrate thousands of troops through this territory, which means that when talking about this direction, this is probably the easiest direction for Russians to continue advancing, and the Russians entered also the big forest of Sumy. And the third direction is the southeastern direction, but this direction was stopped by Russians probably months or two ago. For some reason, the Russians stopped advancing further in the western direction. Maybe there are some difficulties, or maybe the Russians are regrouping in this area. Who knows? So as of now, it's very difficult to say what exactly is happening there. The most important thing is that during this period of time, the Russians also opened the fourth direction, and we are talking about the northwestern direction. First of all, several weeks or months ago, the Russians recaptured the settlement of Bessalovka. So this was the first village through the northwestern parts of the Sumy area that was recaptured by Russians. A few weeks or months later, the Russians reported that they improved their positions through the village of Ryzhovka, and the Russians began advancing further in the southern direction towards the road R44 and the villages of Vorozhba and Bilopolye. And today, several pro-Russian sources reported that Russians also improved their positions through the village of Rogozhne. So now we can see that this is not just a local offensive operation with the purpose to improve the positions along the line of combat contact. It seems that the Russians opened another front line, and now the Russians, using broad front line attack, are trying to develop their offensive operation further in the southern direction towards the city of Sumy, but this time from the northwest. The Russians most likely are tasked to take on the complete control this territory and cut main logistic lines, and to create a very difficult situation for the city of Sumy itself, because from these positions, the Russians most likely from the territory of these two towns like Bilopolye and Vorozhba, the Russians would be able to establish complete FPV drone control over the territory behind the city of Sumy in the western and the southwestern direction along the main supply lines. So it's obviously that the city of Sumy is one of the most important targets for Russia, at least for the late 2026 and for the entire 2027. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kharkiv direction, where the changes were also recorded. These days, the Russians are tasked just with one thing. The Russians are tasked to establish complete control over the territory in the most eastern parts of the Kharkiv region. We're talking about this pocket. The Russians advance every single day. Every single day we receive updates from this area, and the previous 24 hours weren't exception from this rule. So, for example, these are the changes on the ground between the dates. So this is the end of the 10th of August. This is the end of the 11th of August. The Russians improved their positions through the eastern flank. This is the 12th of August. The Russians improved their positions along the entire line of combat contact. And this is already the big end of the 13th of August of 2026. The Russians captured several tree lines. The Russians improved their positions through the village of Vasilievka. So as you can see, the Russians continue tightening the noose around positions of the armored forces of Ukraine through the most northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. There are just 4 villages in this area. We're talking about this belt of settlements in the most northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region: the village of Chorne, Nefedovka, Blagodatne, and Vasilievka. If these 4 villages fall, then the Russians will encircle the contingent of the armored forces of Ukraine through the entire northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, with probably hundreds of soldiers of the armored forces of Ukraine. At the same time, the Russians continue bombing and attacking positions of the armored forces of Ukraine to the south of the possible cauldron, trying to soften defenses of the armored forces of Ukraine. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation through the Slaviansk-Drushkovka direction. Once again, as we discussed during the previous video, in coming days we expect that the pro-Ukrainian sources will report about results of the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation to the north of the city of Liman. So we expect that in coming days, additional changes on the ground could be revealed in this area in Ukrainian favor. But as of now, we have nothing. The Ukrainians just during the previous 24 hours reported about additional changes on the ground through the Ivanovka direction. We have already discussed this, but according to different sources, and according to my opinion, in coming days, we might receive updates about this territory as well. As for the city of Drushkovka, the Russians improved their positions during the previous 24 hours. According to different sources, the Russians captured the settlement of Petrivka to the west of the settlement of Drushkovka, and these are the changes on the ground between the previous 3 days. This is the end of the 11th, this is the end of the 12th, and this is the end of the 13th of August of 2026, and the Russians improved their positions through the settlement of Alexeyevo-Drushkovka. As you can see, the Russians improved their positions through the settlement of Osikova and through the southern parts of the settlement of Alexeyevo-Drushkovka. Right now, the Russians are tasked to get as close as possible to this territory and basically to cut the northern and the southern parts of the settlement, and this will allow the Russians to fight with every single part of the settlement separately. So this is exactly what the Russians are trying to achieve. As of the end of the 13th of July of 2026, the Russians control up to probably 5 to 10% of the Alexeyevo-Drushkovka agglomeration. Another important thing is that the Russians these days, according to different sources, also are trying to improve their positions between the cities of Dobropolye and Kramatorsk. And these are the changes on the ground. We add additional gray zones, additional infiltration areas. The Russians approach the settlement of Kucherov Yar from the south. The battle most likely begins. The Russians improve their positions towards the settlement of Gruska, and the Russians answered the settlement of Novomikhailivka, and currently up to 50 or even more percent of the settlement of Novomikhailivka is already in the gray zone. So the Russians continue advancing, trying to maintain the line between the settlement of Dobropolye and the southwestern parts of the settlement of Drushkovka. So most likely we will see this offensive operation even before the beginning of the major battle for the settlement of Drushkovka. The Russians would try to improve their positions in the northern direction, trying to get as close as possible to the main logistics and the main supply lines of the city of Kramatorsk, and basically to get the city of Kramatorsk from behind. So this offensive operation might be very, very dangerous for the armed forces of Ukraine, and we see that the Russians are moving and are trying to develop this direction every day. As for the Zaporozhye-Ivanovka direction, during the previous 24 hours, as we discussed, the map has been adjusted significantly. These are the changes on the ground between the dates. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported, published a video with hundreds of flags, dozens of flags raised through this area. Later, this information was confirmed by the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, and later, this information was also confirmed by pro-Russian sources that this pocket was completely recaptured by the armed forces of Ukraine. Furthermore, we have videos published by Russian sources where we can also see assault groups of the armed forces of Ukraine trying to cross the river of Volcha with the purpose to continue offensive operation in this area, and how the Russians were attacking these forces with FPV drones. So Ukrainians continue counteroffensive. As for this area, the most important update, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, is that the Ukrainians are not going to stop, and that despite the fact that the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, announced the end of the operation, we received the report that the Ukrainians continue counteroffensive, that they crossed the river of Mokry Yali and entered the village of Kamar from the west. So the second battle for the village of Kamar begins, and this might be a very dangerous situation for the Russian side. As for the Orekhov and Zaporozhye directions, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. The Russians attacked the territory with aviation, trying to soften defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, the most important thing that's the situation with the Ivanovka direction was something that's the Russians haven't discussed since the beginning of this situation. So obviously there is a crisis right now in this area, and we don't know the Russian sources, the Russian military experts haven't discussed the situation. So, which means that the Ukrainians had possibilities to continue developing this counteroffensive operation, because if pro-Russian sources began discussing a crisis through the territory of this pocket, then of course the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation would be forced to react, would be forced to send additional reinforcements and reserves to stabilize the situation. So that is why this counteroffensive operation from the Ukrainian side was carried out under very big secret. And the Russians, of course, despite the fact that they saw the situation, they didn't do anything, because while there is no crisis, while there is no scandal in this area, so that is why there is no need to send additional forces for stabilization. But due to the fact that this counteroffensive operation from the Ukrainian side was revealed, this forced the Russians to start reacting, to start sending additional reinforcements, reserves, and probably these reinforcements and reserves were also taken from the Orekhov direction. So, which means that now the Russians would be forced to react to this counteroffensive operation, would be forced to begin their own counteroffensive operation with the purpose to recapture lost territories, which means that most likely the Zaporozhye, the main part of the Zaporozhye offensive operation, would be postponed for 1 or maybe 2 months, and most likely due to the situation, the Russians would be forced even to postpone their offensive operation through the city of Orekhov itself. Anyway, let's wait and see how the things are going to develop, but as of now, the most important thing, the Russian answer on Ukraine's proposal to stop attacking each other. And that's it for today. The military summary